Imagine this, a rich, private school cafeteria falls silent as a spoiled heir slaps the new black scholarship girl across the face. Everyone laughs, until she looks at her watch and whispers, 3 minutes. That's all I need. 3 minutes later, the entire school learns she's not a victim, she's a federal agent. The slap cracked through the cafeteria like a gunshot, silencing 200 voices mid-laughter. A carton of chocolate milk burst open on the marble floor, spreading in slow motion across the polished tiles of Ridgemont Academy's dining hall. Grace Sullivan didn't move. The new black girl, the one on scholarship, the one who wasn't supposed to belong here, stood perfectly still. Her cheek burned red, but her eyes, those calm, unwavering eyes, never blinked. Preston Blackwood's smirk widened. "Smile," he sneered, his voice dripping with entitlement. "You're the diversity quota." His friends erupted in laughter, the kind of laughter that only comes from power, safe, cruel, and confident it will never face consequence. Grace just looked at him, silent, as if she were studying something beneath the noise, beneath the arrogance. The golden light pouring from the high windows made the scene look almost holy, but there was nothing holy about the moment. The air grew thick. A fork clattered somewhere. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Grace tilted her head slightly, glanced down at her watch, and whispered, almost to herself, 3 minutes. That's all I need. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a wire pulled taut. Preston blinked. "What did you say?" he asked, laughing nervously. "You gonna cry in 3 minutes?" More laughter followed, but weaker this time. Some students exchanged uneasy glances. A girl raised her phone higher, recording. Grace's expression didn't change. She stood straight, her posture controlled, her breathing steady, as though she had been through worse storms than this one. The light above flickered once, just enough to make the room feel colder. Preston stepped closer. "You hear me talking to you, scholarship?" He poked her shoulder with 2 fingers, casual, cruel. "Maybe you don't understand how this place works. You don't talk unless you're spoken to." Grace didn't flinch. She looked past him, scanning the room like someone measuring escape routes. Her gaze lingered on the clock above the exit. 2 minutes, 40 seconds. "What?" Preston barked, impatient. "You think you're better than us?" She finally looked back at him, her eyes calm, voice barely above a whisper. "No. Just different." That single word, different, hung in the air like smoke. Some kids laughed again, but their laughter sounded forced now. Even the sound of forks scraping plates stopped. The air had shifted. Something in her stillness unnerved them. Preston frowned, confused that his slap hadn't broken her. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he said louder, but the command felt hollow. For the first time, it wasn't her who looked small, it was him. Her calmness drained his confidence, and he didn't even know why. Grace's lips moved again, but he couldn't hear. "What was that?" he asked, stepping closer. She smiled faintly. 2 minutes. He stared at her, trying to decide if she was crazy or dangerous. The camera phones caught everything, her stillness, his growing frustration, the strange tension wrapping around them like invisible smoke. In the far corner, someone whispered, "She's not even scared." Grace blinked slowly, unbothered, almost serene. Somewhere deep inside her pocket, a faint vibration buzzed once, barely audible, but she didn't react. Her fingers brushed against the fabric, acknowledging it. Preston noticed her hand and smirked again. "Texting for help?" "No one's coming for you here." She looked up at him and said softly, "You're right. They're already here." The words meant nothing to him, but something in the way she said them made the back of his neck prickle. Around them, laughter died completely. The cafeteria had turned into a stage, and neither of them knew the script except her. 3 minutes. That's all she needed. 3 weeks earlier, Ridgemont Academy shimmered under a pale Connecticut sky, its Gothic towers cutting through the morning haze like blades of privilege. The marble floors were so polished they reflected the ceiling lights, and every hallway smelled faintly of money and fear. On the bulletin board near the main office, a fresh list of new students was pinned up. At the very bottom, in smaller print, it read, Grace Sullivan, Full Scholarship/Community Outreach Program. That one line was all anyone needed to know to place her where they thought she belonged. When Grace walked through those doors for the first time, the hum of conversation thinned. Students turned to look. Some whispered, some smiled the kind of smile that never reached their eyes. She didn't react. She adjusted her backpack strap and kept walking, her sneakers silent on the stone floor. Her eyes scanned everything, the security cameras, the blind spots, the timing of the hallway monitors, the exits. Her gaze wasn't nervous. It was calculating. At lunch, two girls at the next table decided to test her. One of them, blonde with pearls around her neck, deliberately dropped a notebook beside Grace's tray. A dare flickered between them. Let's see if she picks it up, one whispered. Grace leaned down, picked up the notebook, and handed it back. You dropped something, she said calmly. The girl smirked. Guess not all of you are rude. Grace's eyes met hers for a beat too long before she replied softly, you dropped your humanity too. The table went silent. The girls laughed it off a second later, pretending it hadn't stung, but the silence that followed said otherwise. Grace returned to her food, slow, methodical, eyes observing everything through the faint reflection in her water bottle. That night, her dorm room light glowed dimly while others slept. Her desk was perfectly organized, a titanium pen, a notebook with no name, a phone with its camera lens covered. She opened the back of her school badge, revealing a micro camera no bigger than a rice grain. She checked its battery, then closed it carefully. The next morning in class, the teacher, a man who'd spent decades among children of politicians and CEOs, introduced her to the room. Everyone, this is Grace Sullivan. She comes to us from Kansas, right? She nodded once. The class stared. Kansas might as well have been another planet. The teacher smiled politely. Do you feel different being here, Grace? He asked, expecting her to stutter or shy away. Instead, she looked up, eyes steady. I was taught to notice before being noticed. The room went still. He didn't understand the weight of what she'd said, but a few students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Grace's titanium pen scratched across the page, but she wasn't taking notes from the board. She was mapping people. She wrote in shorthand, symbols that only she could decode, recording who whispered to whom, who looked guilty when certain names were mentioned, who avoided eye contact at the word party. Every movement mattered. Every laugh had context. When the bell rang, she waited until everyone left before standing. Her hand brushed over the desk, fingertips tracing a faint engraving, something carved long ago, MC 2021. Melissa Chen. One of the missing girls. Grace paused, just for a second. Then she took a small photo from her pocket, a smiling teenager in the same uniform, and slid it into her notebook. Her eyes hardened. The next day, during assembly, she noticed a ring on Preston Blackwood's finger, a serpent curled around a key. The same symbol she had seen on a chain in that old photo. Her pulse slowed, not sped up. That was how she trained herself. Control first, emotion later. A faint buzz from her phone in her pocket, a coded message. Phoenix, report visual updates in 72 hours. She locked the screen. To everyone else, she was just the quiet scholarship girl sitting alone in the cafeteria. But beneath the stillness, something much larger was already moving. Grace Sullivan was not observing a school. She was infiltrating a network. And in 3 weeks, the hunters would learn they'd been the prey all along. The third-floor hallway was quieter than the rest of Ridgemont Academy, a place that existed between classes and secrets. The lights hummed faintly, one flickering every few seconds, throwing long shadows across the floor. Students avoided this stretch unless they had to. Everyone knew it was Preston Blackwood's territory, the part of the school where rules bent for his amusement. That afternoon, Grace walked alone, her steps measured, her eyes fixed ahead. She could feel the shift in the air before she heard him. Preston's voice came first, smooth and arrogant. "Well, if it isn't our scholarship superstar. Lost your way again, Kansas?" Grace didn't answer. She kept walking, eyes down, pace steady. He moved in front of her, blocking the corridor. The smirk on his face carried the same casual cruelty that came from a lifetime of never hearing the word no. "You know," he said, circling her slowly, "I've been thinking. Maybe this place needs limits. You people don't always know where you belong." Grace stopped. The hallway felt smaller. Her reflection in the glass trophy case behind him stared back, calm, unreadable. Preston leaned closer, his breath laced with expensive coffee and entitlement. "Say something," he demanded. "What's the matter, scholarship? The cat got your courage?" Still nothing. Grace's silence unnerved him in ways he didn't understand. He expected fear, stuttering, pleading, but instead, she just watched him, head slightly tilted, as though analyzing an experiment gone wrong. His grin faltered. "Don't look at me like that," he snapped. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, harder than necessary. The sound of his skin meeting hers echoed faintly off the walls. Her breathing shifted, not in panic, but in precision. Inhale 4 seconds. Exhale 4. Controlled. Trained. Preston's grip tightened until his knuckles whitened. "You think you're special," he whispered. "You're just a charity case wearing our uniform." Grace's eyes dropped to his hand. She spoke softly, almost kindly. "Funny, you have the same calluses as someone who ties wrists for a living." Preston froze. "What?" he said, forcing a laugh, but his fingers twitched. Grace looked up, her expression blank. Blackwood Industries. Founded 2003. Missing tax records from 2019 to 2021. Same years 3 girls vanished from your previous school. His entire posture changed. The arrogance cracked, replaced by something raw, fear, confusion, maybe both. "What did you just say?" he hissed. "Who told you that?" "Public information," she said, stepping closer, her tone almost gentle. "If you know where to look." For the first time, Preston took a step back. The flickering light above buzzed louder, and the corridor felt colder. Grace glanced at the security camera in the corner, its lens covered in dust, long ignored. Perfect. She turned to leave, but he caught her arm again, this time shaking. "You don't know anything," he said quickly. "You're just making things up." "Maybe," she said. "But you look guilty for someone who's innocent." His face hardened. "You think you can play detective here?" "You're lucky I don't," she cut him off with a look. "You already did." The cafeteria. Cameras caught everything. "So did I." Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. Every word was measured, surgical. He didn't notice her right hand tapping lightly against her thigh, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS transmission confirmed. The faintest vibration from her phone in her pocket signaled receipt. Preston's eyes darted between her face and her wrist. "You're crazy," he muttered, but his voice wavered. Grace smiled, not cruelly, but knowingly. "Crazy?" she said. "No. Prepared." She stepped past him, her shoulder brushing his just enough to make him flinch. As she walked away, her reflection in the glass looked back like a shadow from another world. The silence behind her felt heavier than words. Preston stood frozen, his chest tight, heart racing in a way he hadn't felt before. He turned to watch her disappear down the hall, that calm, unhurried walk burning itself into his mind. For the first time in his life, Preston Blackwood, the predator of Ridgemont, felt hunted. The cafeteria roared with noise, laughter, and flashing phones. Preston Blackwood stood on a table, phone held high, live streaming to his followers. The screen title read, "Teaching the Scholarship Girl a Lesson." His friends from the Elite Eight surrounded him, their laughter echoing off the walls. Hundreds of students watched, some cheering, others too afraid to move. Grace Sullivan sat in the middle of it all, her blouse stained with milk, her tray overturned. The crowd expected tears, anger, something human. But Grace simply picked up a napkin, wiped the milk from her sleeve, and stood. Her voice, when it came, was steady enough to slice through the chaos. "You just hit a federal witness," she said quietly. Then she paused, eyes never leaving Preston's. "Congratulations. That's 5 extra years." The laughter faltered, confusion rippling through the crowd. Preston blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. Then he laughed, louder than before. "You think this is a movie?" he sneered. "You gonna call the FBI on me?" His audience joined in, desperate to keep the power balance the way it always was. Grace didn't answer. She reached into her pocket, tapped her phone once. Instantly, the live stream feed on Preston's phone shifted. The screen flickered and then displayed a string of encrypted messages in bold white text over a black background, "Shipment confirmed. Friday. East basement." Preston froze. His laughter died in his throat. The entire cafeteria seemed to lean forward as one, eyes flicking from his face to the phone. Grace's tone didn't change. T-30 seconds. Her voice was soft, calm, but final. "Everyone down." Nobody moved. Preston stepped closer, shaking now. "What did you do?" Grace looked at him, finally, fully, and for the first time, the predator saw something in her eyes that terrified him. It wasn't rage. It was authority. "You should kneel, Preston," she said. "It's going to get loud." The lights flickered once. Then came the explosion. The double doors at the end of the cafeteria blew inward in a flash of white smoke and sound. Students screamed, diving for cover as tactical units in black uniforms poured through the haze, shouting commands. "FBI. Hands where we can see them." Preston stumbled backward, dropping his phone, which clattered and spun across the floor. Grace didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the chaos, perfectly still, milk still drying on her sleeve, eyes reflecting the strobe of flashing lights. A man in an FBI vest strode through the doorway, helmet tucked under his arm, voice cutting through the confusion. "Agent Sullivan," he called. "Report your status." The room went dead silent. Preston turned toward Grace, disbelief twisting his face. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge. It caught the overhead light, glinting like judgment itself. "Junior Agent Grace Sullivan. Task Force Delta, 77, she said clearly. Gasps filled the cafeteria. Every phone still recording captured the moment, the quiet girl, the scholarship student, the victim, revealed as something entirely different. Preston dropped to his knees, his world cracking open in real time. "No," he stammered. "No, this isn't real." "You can't be." Grace walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate, eyes level with his. "3 missing girls," she said, voice low enough for only him to hear. "Melissa Chen. Jennifer Park. Ashley Rivera. They're alive. We found them. And their blood is on your family's payroll." Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came. His hands trembled as agents surrounded him, zip-tying his wrists, the same kind of ties that had left calluses on his fingers. Grace crouched slightly, meeting his eyes. "You said I didn't belong here," she whispered. "You were right. I belonged somewhere above you." The weight of the line landed harder than any punch. Preston's mask shattered. His friends from the Elite Eight stood frozen, phones still in their hands, streaming the fall of their king live to the world. Across the room, students pressed against the walls, watching the hierarchy of Ridgemont collapse in a single breath. The agent at the door called out again. Primary target secured. Proceeding to East Basement. Grace gave a short nod. Copy that. Proceed. Sirens wailed in the distance, mixing with the sound of sobbing and whispers. Preston looked up at her, eyes wet now, pleading. You don't understand, he said, voice cracking. It wasn't all me. Grace's expression didn't change. It never is, she said. But today, it starts with you. The FBI led him away, his cries swallowed by the sound of orders and boots. Grace turned once, scanning the room. Every student who had laughed earlier now looked at her with something between fear and awe. She picked up her tray, set it neatly on the counter, and walked toward the door as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Behind her, the phones kept recording, the whispers grew louder, and the legend of the quiet black girl began to spread through Ridgemont Academy like wildfire. The campus of Ridgemont Academy no longer looked like a school. Red and blue lights washed over the ancient stone walls as helicopters hovered low enough to rattle the windows. Police cars lined the perimeter, their sirens pulsing in the cold night air. The once pristine courtyard was now a staging ground for federal agents, SWAT officers, and forensic teams. The golden crest of the academy gleamed dully under floodlights, stripped of its prestige, exposed for what it had really been, a mask. Grace Sullivan stood near the main entrance, her hand steady though her heartbeat drummed in her ears. Around her, the organized chaos of justice unfolded. Agents moved in coordinated precision, barking codes, securing suspects, collecting evidence. The sound of radios crackling with updates filled the air. East Building cleared. 3 survivors located, came the call. Grace turned toward the paramedics rushing across the lawn, 3 stretchers carried side by side. The girls, Melissa Chen, Jennifer Park, Ashley Rivera, were alive, barely conscious, eyes blinking against the light after weeks of darkness. Their wrists were bruised, but they were breathing. Grace exhaled slowly, one hand resting against the wall to steady herself. Every mission had faces, but not all missions ended with survivors. This one did. For now. A black Bentley pulled up at the edge of the courtyard, tires screeching to a stop. The door opened and Richard Blackwood stepped out, fury in every movement. He was immaculate in a dark suit, tie perfect, hair combed back with precision. His voice carried like thunder as he pushed past the perimeter tape. "This is an outrage," he barked. "You have no jurisdiction here. These are children, not criminals." He shoved his way toward Grace, his gaze landing on her badge. "Who the hell are you?" She turned to face him. The camera lights from nearby news vans caught her face, composed, unreadable. "Grace Sullivan," she said evenly. "Federal Task Force. And your son is in custody for human trafficking, conspiracy, and assaulting a federal agent." Richard's laugh was sharp, hollow. "My son? Trafficking? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I built this city's schools, its hospitals, its charities," Grace interrupted, her tone colder than the night air. "And its cages." She lifted her phone. A holographic projection bloomed in the space between them, an intricate web of names and lines connecting 12 prestigious schools across the East Coast. At the center pulsed a symbol, a serpent wrapped around a key. "We call it the Hydra Network," Grace said. 7 main branches. Each school feeding victims into your pipeline. Children, Mr. Blackwood. Your empire runs on children. The surrounding agents fell silent as the scale of it spread before their eyes. Richard's face paled. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You fabricated this to make a name for yourself." A voice broke through from behind them. "That's enough." Principal Henderson approached, his face red with anger, sweat beading on his temple. Agent Sullivan, you're overstepping. Ridgemont is an institution of excellence, not a crime scene. Grace turned her head slightly, studying him for a moment before speaking. Principal Henderson, she said softly. Or should I call you Kevin Matthews? East Coast coordinator of the Blackwood Ring. The courtyard went silent. Henderson's breath caught. What did you just say? Grace took a step closer. We've had your alias flagged for 6 months. Offshore accounts, encrypted calls, and one particularly sloppy transaction, $20,000 wired to a holding company named Morningside Logistics. Care to guess who owns that company? Henderson's composure shattered. He turned to run. He didn't make it 3 steps before a SWAT officer brought him down hard, pinning him to the ground. Agents closed in, reading him his rights as he shouted about lawyers and mistakes. Grace watched quietly, her expression unreadable. Richard Blackwood's rage turned to desperation. You think this changes anything? He said, stepping closer. You think you've won? You don't even know how deep this goes. I don't need to, she said. I just need to start somewhere. A voice crackled through her earpiece. Sullivan, update from Hartford Docks. Container BWXU 793 secured. 23 victims alive. Requesting medical and federal transport. Grace's jaw tightened. 23 more. She whispered a quick acknowledgement and ended the call. The courtyard around her buzzed with movement, but her mind drifted elsewhere, to a photo tucked in her wallet, worn from being handled too many times. Emma. Her sister's smile. The same age as the girls on those stretchers. The same light in her eyes before the world turned cruel. Grace's vision blurred for a moment, the mix of exhaustion and memory pressing against her chest. She blinked it away, forcing herself back into the moment. Agent Mills approached from behind, his heavy footsteps measured. You did good work, he said, voice low but sincere. 3 girls alive here, 23 more at the docks. That's a start. Grace nodded once. It's not enough. Mills followed her gaze toward the stretchers. It never is, he said quietly. Around them, reporters shouted questions, their lights flashing like lightning. Agent Sullivan. Is it true the Blackwood family funded the academy's expansion? Is Preston Blackwood cooperating? Are more arrests coming? Grace ignored them all. Her focus was on Richard, who stood still now, his power draining from him with each passing second. Agents read him his rights as they cuffed him. He didn't resist. He just stared at Grace, a hint of venom left in his eyes. You think justice is real? He spat. You think your badge means anything against men like me? Grace took 1 step closer, her shadow falling across his face. No, she said quietly. It means something to the girls you sold. The agents led him away. The sound of helicopters returned, blades cutting through the night like restless ghosts. Grace looked around one last time, the flashing lights, the shattered illusions, the pieces of a world built on wealth and silence finally breaking apart. For a brief second, she let herself breathe. Justice had come to Ridgemont, but in her gut, she knew this was only one head of something much darker. Somewhere out there, the rest of the Hydra still moved, still feeding, still waiting for the next quiet girl to disappear. The night had begun to settle over Ridgemont Academy, soft and heavy, the chaos giving way to a strange quiet. The floodlights that had once lit the courtyard were dimming, replaced by the fading gold of sunset stretching across the broken windows. Grace Sullivan stood by the steps, arms folded loosely, watching as the last of the ambulances pulled away. The flashing red lights reflected in her eyes before fading into the distance. The noise of sirens grew softer until only the whisper of wind and the hum of the generators remained. An officer walked up behind her, boots crunching on gravel. He hesitated before speaking, his tone careful, almost respectful. Agent Sullivan, he said quietly, why did you do all this? You could have been anywhere, but you chose this. Grace didn't turn at first. She kept her eyes on the road where the ambulances had disappeared. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, but laced with something raw beneath it. Because Emma didn't make it out. The officer frowned slightly. Emma? Grace reached into her jacket and pulled out her wallet. Inside, behind her badge, was a small photograph, creased, faded, but still bright enough to hurt. It showed a girl no older than 16, brown skin glowing under sunlight, wearing the same Ridgemont uniform Grace had worn for the past few weeks. The same crest, the same tie. The only difference was the smile, soft, uncertain, and already tired of proving its worth. My sister, Grace said quietly. She went to this school 2 years ago. Same scholarship program. Same promises. The officer said nothing. The air between them carried more truth than sound. Grace's eyes didn't leave the picture. She was smart, kind. Believed every word they told her about opportunity. Until she went missing. 3 months later, she came back. Grace swallowed, her voice tightening slightly. But she wasn't really back. She couldn't sleep, couldn't talk about what happened. Said she saw things no one would believe. And when she finally started to, no one listened. They called it trauma. Therapy. Recovery. But it wasn't recovery. It was drowning. She looked up at the fading sky. 6 months later, she took her own life. The silence that followed was sharp and unbroken. Even the wind seemed to stop. Grace's fingers brushed the edge of the photo before slipping it back into her wallet. When I found out what really happened, the girls, the ring, the schools, it wasn't just a case anymore. It was a promise. The officer's voice was soft. To her. Grace nodded. To her. And to every girl who never got out. The ones who didn't have a badge, or a voice, or anyone to believe them. She exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxing for the first time that night. You see, I didn't join the bureau because I wanted to be an agent. I joined because I got tired of watching people like Emma die quietly. I wanted the world to hear them scream, even if they couldn't anymore. The officer shifted his weight, unsure how to respond. He finally said, "You did more than that tonight." Grace gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "No," she said. "I just opened a door. Someone else will have to walk through it." From the distance came the low thrum of helicopter blades heading toward Hartford, where 23 more victims waited to be seen. Grace turned to watch them fade into the horizon, the glow of their searchlights disappearing one by one. Behind her, Ridgemont's grand facade loomed like a wounded giant, its windows reflecting nothing but darkness. "They built this place to make leaders," she murmured. "Turns out it made monsters too." The officer nodded, his face grim. "And you stopped them?" Grace shook her head slowly. "No. I stopped one head of the Hydra. The others are still out there. And I'll find them." She looked out over the campus one last time, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma deserved better. They all did. The sun dipped below the trees, leaving only the sound of her words hanging in the air. In that silence, for the first time, Grace let herself feel the weight of everything she'd held in, the loss, the duty, the fire that had kept her alive when grief tried to bury her. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Night had swallowed Ridgemont Academy whole. The floodlights were gone, the agents were gone, the noise of helicopters had faded into distant hums. What remained was silence and the hollow echo of a building that had seen too much. Yellow tape fluttered weakly in the wind, marking off the cafeteria where everything had begun. Grace Sullivan stood outside, the shards of glass still glittering at her feet. Through the broken window she could see the overturned tables, the streaks of dried milk on the floor, the faint outline of chaos left behind. It was quiet now, but in her mind she could still hear it, the slap, the laughter, the moment when the world had decided she didn't belong. Only now, that same world was on its knees. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath fade into the cold. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. Unknown number. She unlocked it. A single message appeared: "Impressive work, little wolf. Hydra has 6 more heads." She read it twice, then looked out toward the tree line where a black sedan sat idling, headlights off, just barely visible in the dark. Someone was waiting. She slid the phone back into her pocket as footsteps approached behind her. Agent Mills appeared, his coat collar turned up against the wind. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was something like pride behind his eyes. "You could walk away, you know," he said quietly. "You've done more than anyone expected. 26 people are alive tonight because of you. You could disappear, start over. No one would blame you." Grace didn't look at him. She was still watching the cafeteria. "Normal ended the day Emma died," she said softly. "Justice started when I stopped pretending to be small." Mills studied her for a long moment. "You sure you're ready for what comes next? Hydra doesn't take kindly to people cutting off their heads." Grace turned then, meeting his gaze. "Neither do wolves," she said. He almost smiled, then nodded once. "Then go. They're waiting." She walked past him without another word. The sound of her boots against the cracked pavement was the only rhythm left in the night. As she neared the car, the wind carried faint traces of her sister's voice in her memory, the way Emma used to laugh, soft and free, before the world turned cruel. Grace touched the photo in her pocket, fingers brushing against its worn edges like a silent vow. The car door opened with a click. Inside, the driver's face was hidden in shadow, only a silhouette against the dim dashboard light. "Agent Sullivan," the voice said, digitally distorted. "The next operation's ready. 6 branches remain. Are you prepared?" Grace slid into the back seat, her face half lit by the glow of the city far behind them. "Prepared?" she said quietly. "No. But I'm coming anyway." The car pulled away from the curb, tires crunching over gravel, the sound blending into the night until nothing was left but the whisper of wind and the fading hum of the engine. Behind them, Ridgemont stood dark and still, sealed behind caution tape and silence. In the cafeteria, a single chair rocked back into place from the breeze, tapping once against the floor. The sound echoed faintly, like a memory of that first slap, the moment that started everything. Grace didn't look back. She never did. Ahead of her, the road stretched long and empty, lined with shadows and possibilities. Somewhere beyond those trees were the 6 remaining heads of the Hydra. Somewhere, more girls were waiting to be found. The world outside didn't know her name yet, but soon it would. Justice wasn't a badge or a title. It was the quiet determination of someone who had already lost everything and refused to stop fighting. As the car disappeared into the darkness, the first raindrops began to fall, washing over the academy's cracked steps, erasing the last traces of milk and blood. The slap that once humiliated her now echoed like thunder in the distance, a sound that promised the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.